So in today's gospel, interestingly enough from Matthew, because normally we get the bulk of our theology from the Gospel of John, and we get more of the humanity of Christ through Matthew and through Mark. But here we have two very important tenets of Orthodox theology in one reading. One of them is, "And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it, and I will give you the keys to the kingdom of heaven." Okay? And so in this, we have the Catholic Church's interpretation that the keys to the kingdom of heaven have been given solely to Peter, and that Peter now is the head of the church, and thus gives the authority for the Bishop of Rome not only to be the Patriarch of Rome, as we rightfully call him, but also to be the head of the universal church and then to rightfully assume the title of Pope. The Orthodox Church does not see it in that way. And one of the reasons for that is in the very next line, because it says, "And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." The Catholic Church believes that the power to remit or to forgive sins was given to all the apostles. And through apostolic succession, like myself, that we as priests and bishops have this power to either forgive sins or to retain sins. So we can't, as Orthodox, we can't split these two things up and say, well, on one hand, this was given only to Peter, and then on the other hand, this was the forgiveness of sins was granted to all the apostles. It is strictly one or the other. And interestingly enough, in the early church, before there was Orthodoxy and Catholicism, the Holy Fathers did not speak about Peter being the sole inheritor of the keys to the kingdom of heaven. So Clement of Rome spoke about this, Ignatius spoke about this, and most importantly, St. Augustine spoke about this. And interestingly, what St. Augustine says, if this was said only to Peter, it gives no ground of action to the church. But if such is the case, then also in the church, what is bound on earth, bound in heaven, what is loosed on earth, loosed in heaven. For the church excommunicates, and one is reconciled through the church. If such is the case in the church, then Christ, in Peter saying receives the kingdom of heaven, he represents then the church. And so we as Orthodox agree with that this is not the sole responsibility of Peter, but that the rock that he speaks about in terms of what the Holy Fathers write is that Christ himself is the rock. And now the church, his bride, now receives these to the kingdom of heaven. Why do we say that? Because the keys to the kingdom of heaven were in the hands of the Pharisees. And the Pharisees abused that, and now Jesus takes the keys from them and now gives them to his disciples, and paramount among the first of them is Peter. And along with that, he gives now the authority to bind and to loose sins. So we have Jesus Christ, in the interpretation of Augustine and the Fathers, Christ as the rock, and Peter now representing the church through which all of us as priests and bishops, as clergy, receive that apostolic succession to be able now to bind and loose sins. So, because many times you're going to hear this about, the keys to the kingdom, and how do we as Orthodox explain that? And we can explain it through one of the paramount Holy Fathers of the Catholic Church, which is St. Augustine himself. And then secondly, this wonderful last line in here is the theology of how we treat sins and this ability to bind and loosen sins. out of this comes this beautiful and wonderful and misunderstood sacrament of confession. Now, I want to save the whole confession thing for another sermon, but it is important to note that we have received this as apostolic succession, and we as the Orthodox Church, along with the Catholic Church, see this as the sacrament now that reconciles us to God and allows us to approach with boldness and without the fear of condemnation, as we hear in the liturgy, to approach then the cup of Christ. And so this is why it's so important for us to look at our actions, to look at our words, to look at how we deal with one another. And before we can approach, we have to understand, have we made proper confession? Do we approach with the love of God? Or do we harbor ill will or ill feelings to someone? Which may in some cases be genuine, and other cases may be misdirected. Regardless of the case, before we can approach without fear and the fear of condemnation, then we must be very clear on what it is that we are approaching with. And if we are approaching with anything but abiding love in our hearts for each one of those who are the image and likeness of God, then approach with boldness. But if we are not, then as St. John Chrysostom says, then lay your gifts aside, go and reconcile with your brother or sister, and then return in love. So in this gospel reading today, we have two very important tenets of the Orthodox Church: how we view the keys to the kingdom of heaven, and how we view the importance of the sacrament of confession before we receive Holy Communion.